Hello, everybody. Welcome into another episode of the Couch GMs podcast. It is Tuesday, December 7th, 2021. I'm your host, George Kurth, and I'm joined by the one and only Cody Roadcap. Cody, how are you?
I'm doing great, George. Feeling refreshed after the bye week, ready for the stretch run we got going for the rest of the NFL season.
And I'm feeling good going into the bye week, having a single-handed Couch GM sweep this week with two Couch GMs teams on bye, but we'll take it how we can get it. This week on the show, we're going to be covering some NFL news and notes. We're going to hit our Week 14 waivers, the last week before the fantasy playoffs, if you're doing it right. So, important waiver wire segment here. And we're going to preview Thursday night football for Week 14. I also want to note before we jump into news that I won our bet with Tyler last week. So, stay tuned our next episode on Friday, or I guess it's Saturday this week, where Tyler will have to wear a fake mustache the entire episode. But why don't we just jump into NFL news? There's one other thing I'm very excited to talk about. And Cody, I think you could probably guess that thing even without looking at the rundown, but the Detroit Lions did a thing and won a game. Finally, congratulations, Detroit. You basically won your Super Bowl. The season can end now.
And it was even better that you beat the Minnesota Vikings.
Yes, exactly.
Not only and how you did it, I mean, I know there was a lot of criticism from Dan Campbell for initially going for it on 4th and 1 inside their own, I believe it was 30-yard line at the end of the game. And I was like, Dan, you haven't won a game yet. Go for it. I loved the call, even though you didn't convert it. You still came down. You marched right down the field, scored the touchdown, beat the Minnesota Vikings. And, I mean, it's tough because they're both in our division. But any week the Vikings lose is a good week in my book.
So, I mean, I know being an NFC East fan, being an Eagles fan, the team that you normally feel almost sorry for is Washington. They're normally the bottom of the barrel in the division. I feel like Detroit's probably similar for you. Like, you're okay with them winning a couple of games because they're normally that bottom of the barrel team that's like, you kind of feel bad.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not rooting for Detroit at all.
Yeah.
But I know what you're saying. They're at the bottom, typically at the bottom. You almost feel bad for them. So, yeah, I definitely see what you're saying. And can't stand the Vikings. So, definitely beating the Vikings. Hey, that win could cause the Packers to clinch the NFC North this week. We'll talk about that later in the show, or not this show, but next show on the possible scenario if the Packers do clinch the North in this week. But we had some good news with a Lions victory. We do have to talk some bad news. That is COVID-19. It is still a pandemic we are trying to work our way through. 11 players tested positive on Monday. Two of the biggest names are backup quarterback Jordan Love, tested positive. Now he is vaccinated, and it's also worth noting that because Aaron Rodgers already did test positive, luckily they were on bye, so he wasn't a close contact. But you essentially get the vaccination status. It wouldn't matter because you're in your 90-day immunity, the medical side of COVID. So even though Jordan Love did test positive, there's no doubts that Aaron Rodgers should still play this week. But the bigger name, especially heading into Week 14, is Keenan Allen. He had a big game, well, maybe a big first quarter and a half against the
Pretty much
Cincinnati Bengals. That was a wild game to go back and forth on. But Keenan Allen also tested positive. At this time, we're unsure of his vaccination status, so we don't know if he'll be able to make it back in time for Sunday or not. But that could definitely be a big loss if you're looking to get into the playoffs, or luckily if you're already in the playoffs with Keenan Allen, hopefully he should be back for those fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, with it hitting early in the week, his positive test coming on a Monday, even if he is not vaccinated, the 10-day period would mean he would be back for Week 15. So that is good news. Hopefully you don't need him for Week 14, or he does happen to come back before. We'll keep you updated. Hopefully we'll have another update on our show on Saturday. A lot of injury news this week too, which seems to just be a given at this point. Kenyon Drake, we'll start with the worst and we'll try to get better. So Kenyan Drake has suffered a broken ankle this week. He got rolled up on. He is done for the season. I know Josh Jacobs left that game for a bit as well, but came back in and finished the game. that actually might be a help to Josh Jacobs, really, when you think about it, because there's going to be less carries going to the backups now. But not good news for Kenyon Drake. I think it's the second year in a row he had an ankle problem from a tackle.
Yeah, he actually tweeted it out. He said, the NFL won't let you touch a quarterback. It's now challenging our, they call the taunting penalties, but yet this is the second year in a row he's been pulled down from his back and then had his legs rolled up under, causing him to miss time with an ankle injury. So he was pretty upset, but he's on the road to recovery and is looking forward to bouncing back next year. Another name that will be out for the rest of the season is Jets wide receiver Corey Davis. He'll get core muscle surgery. Robert Saleh confirmed that on Monday, said he'll be out for the season. Tough blow for the Jets. On the bright side, though, at least fantasy-wise, Elijah Moore is coming on strong. Could be a solid play down the stretch for the Jets, filling in for Corey Davis, the promising rookie. So that is definitely some big news. And then I'm going to keep rolling through, George, because, that's enough Jets talk for one day.
Yes.
Logan Thomas, uh, the rare fear that he tore his ACL to get the MRI and say, actually, his ACL is still intact, which is good news because Logan Thomas has been dealing with a ton of an injury for the beginning of the season. He came back. Some people will say it was a dirty hit. Some people said it could have been avoided. It was definitely a low hit to the legs. But thankfully, Logan Thomas will not be out for the season. He should be back at some time. When is still being determined, depending on the severity, because there is some damage in his knee. But they do expect to get him back, especially if they make the playoffs. So good news for Logan Thomas.
Yeah, and obviously, back when he originally got hurt, Ricky Seals-Jones was a good fill-in. He did miss this week, but he had a questionable tag, so I feel like he's starting to get closer to coming back. There's a chance that any of you who were relying on Logan Thomas can jump right back to Ricky Seals-Jones for the time being, especially because Washington, as a team, has seemed to be getting better in the last 3-4 weeks. So we'll keep an eye on his status, and we'll try to give you some other options off the waiver wire for tight ends, but I was another one who was really looking forward to Logan Thomas coming back, and all of a sudden another sad situation for him. And we're starting to get a little bit better here. So we go down to the next injury is Adam Thielen. He suffered a high ankle sprain. He was ruled out pretty early in that game. I think it happened in the first quarter. But he's supposed to be week to week. That is going to change the landscape of the Vikings passing attack a little bit. We can talk about that a little bit more when we get to waivers, but Adam Thielen is another big blow, and he may not be back for the start of the fantasy playoffs, but he may be back sometime in the fantasy playoffs.
Yeah, I agree. I think, unfortunately, the Adam Thielen news could be disappointing for fantasy owners. He seems more like a guy that'll get back for the playoffs, similar to how they're approaching the Dalvin Cook situation. They're going to keep fighting. I mean, they can't keep losing to teams like the Lions if they want to make the playoffs, but they're still have a chance to make the playoffs. They're still in the running, so they're going to keep fighting. And Thielen could be a bigger asset for that team to return, week 16, 17, 18, where by that point you've probably had to find different options or are you going to trust in the championship game Adam Thielen back? After one game, it'll be definitely tough to pan out, but we'll be here all through the fantasy playoffs, definitely to make sure we can help you out with your lineups. The big storyline, I'm going to talk about this game again, which was the Chargers Bengals game, the game that started out 24-0, then was 24-22, and then ended 41-22. What a crazy game. I still don't understand how I saw tickets going as low as $26 for that game.
We almost made a
I never
Couch GMs trip out there because of that.
I never wished I lived closer to Cincinnati than I did when I saw that. Two young quarterbacks balling out, and you could go to that game for $26. Crazy. But the big storyline out of that game was Joe Burrow. He had one of those. He threw the ball. His finger got smashed on someone's arm, and he dislocated his pinky. You could tell it was bothering him throughout the game, but he came back and finished. He was able to throw the ball well. I mean, they didn't really score many points after his pinky got hurt, but he was still able to throw the ball. And at first, they thought he'd miss some time, but now he's expected to keep playing. He's going to push through and not miss any time. So I think that's definitely a good thing for the Bengals. I mean, they're in the midst of a playoff rush. I think if they lost Joe Burrow and had to go to their backup quarterback, it'd be tough for them to keep winning. And that's also good for anyone relying on Joe Mixon, Jamar Chase, T. Higgins heading into the fantasy playoffs.
Or even Joe Burrow himself. Like, I know there was in our league of record, my starting quarterback is Jalen Hurts and my backup is Joe Burrow. I had to throw Joe Burrow in the lineup this week because of the Jalen Hurts being injured, and now he goes on bye next week. And I almost had to go and find a replacement for Joe Burrow. It looks like you don't have to do that, and his matchup is easier next week. So we'll definitely talk more about that situation on our later in the week show when we break down the games. But I think Joe Burrow would still not be a bad play. I feel like if he could play through that game with his pinky, it's just going to get better when you get a week under his belt there. And then speaking of the Eagles, we did have one more injury to note, and it was Miles Sanders, who returned recently from an ankle injury, injured his ankle late in that game against the Jets. He left the game, did not return. But the Eagles are on a bye this week, like we said, so it's unsure if he's going to be back for the start of the fantasy playoffs in week 15, but it's a week where he was going to miss anyway, so you might not miss any time for Miles Sanders.
So George, we can hit on this for the waiver. I'll tee it up now, but we'll come back to it for the waiver wire.
Okay.
Boston Scott, he had a goose egg because of his illness,
Mhm.
and the Eagles thing is backfield. But with this injury, and now they're on bye, are you willing to drop Boston Scott for a guy this week, or is Boston Scott a potential hold guy just in case?
I think it depends on your situation. Like, if you're in a must win to get into the fantasy playoffs here, you drop in Boston Scott to try to get somebody who can help you now. If you're in a situation where you're locked in the playoffs, try to hold Boston Scott, or maybe try to go and find Jordan Howard because he probably got dropped in some places too. Because Howard and Scott are going to be the split if Miles Sanders can't go. Either of them might be a good play because the Eagles have shown they want to run the ball and they want to get a bigger back involved with Boston Scott, whether it be Miles Sanders or Jordan Howard.
That's some great advice. Our last news of the week. I mean, there's definitely some more news that out there. It's been a busy week, but the weird timing of this one is definitely up in the air. On Sunday morning, I'm pretty sure at like 1 o'clock Eastern time. So right as games were kicking off, it came out that
Mhm.
the Panthers had fired offensive coordinator Joe Brady. George has made a great point. Like, why do it before the bye week? I mean, why wait
Yeah,
till
like,
after
they
your
were
bye?
on bye this week. Why didn't they do it early in the week last week?
That's a great question. I'm actually really surprised. Joe Brady was a young and up and coming head coach. We'll see if how well he rebounds. This kind of reminds me of the Joe was it named Joe DiFilippo, quarterbacks coach for the Eagles. Then he went to offensive coordinator, and then he was the young guy that was going to get a head coaching job, and then he doesn't even coach in the NFL anymore because
Mhm.
he fell off that quickly. So we'll be interested to see. I thought Joe Brady was going to be a head coach in this cycle. Um, the Panthers did start to struggle. Uh, I mean, he had Sam Darnold look good, then Darnold regressed. Now he had Cam Newton. So I know there was definitely some signs there. This could be like a whole Matt Rule trying to save his job type of thing. Here, let's see what we can do. Give us one more year. I expect Joe Brady to bounce back, whether it's in a college role. I my cousin Chance, he's a big Bengals fan, and at the beginning of the season, when we didn't think the Bengals were as good as they were, but they were winning, I would always joke with them like, you got to stop winning, or you're going to have another year as Zach Taylor. And being at the Bengals game with the Packers earlier, there is a lot of Bengals fans out there that don't like Zach Taylor. They are ready to move on. And Joe Brady was one of the guys that they were interested in because he was the offensive coordinator for Jamar Chase and Joe Burrow for the LSU championship. So it'd be interesting to see if he could somehow sneak his way on to like an offensive assistant head coach position, offensive advisor for the rest of the season with the Bengals. Maybe he goes back to college. I know there's a ton of college jobs opening up. A lot of quarterbacks in the transfer portal, if you pay attention to college, so should be some opportunity there. But I don't think this will be the last we hear of Joe Brady.
Definitely. I mean, I would not be shocked if he even filled in another offensive coordinator role on a NFL team when the offseason rolls around. Maybe if the Bengals do make a move in their coaching staff that isn't their head coach, he ends up an offensive coordinator there next season. We have to wait and see. But definitely a name to watch out for when we get finished with the season and go into the offseason, or maybe even sooner if he decides to go into college, as a lot of college coaching jobs are being filled right now. Um, But with that being said, that wraps up our new segment, and we can get into my favorite segment, Quotes of the Week. And quotes of the week this week, unfortunately, it wasn't a great quote week, but we have to talk a little bit more about the Lions before we move on here. So, Jared Goff talking about Amon-Ra St. Brown after the game winning touchdown. He said, he's a stud and will be in this league for as long as he wants to be in the league. I mean, we really were hyped on St. Brown when all those other Lions wide receivers went down, and it never seemed to pan out. Goff eventually then did say him and Dan Campbell were trying to get St. Brown involved in the offense for the last 6 weeks. It finally came to a peak this week. Do you see this being a one-hit wonder, or is he potentially somebody who could stick around and be relevant here for the rest of the season?
I think definitely relevant for the rest of the season because I mean it's him, it's Josh Reynolds, it's that's
TJ
about it.
Hawkinson.
Yeah, didn't know if I wanted to include him because we were talking wide receivers, but
Yeah.
I think he could definitely bounce around. I think he's talented. I don't know if he'll ever reach like one wide receiver one dominance type of ceiling. Now, with that said, like I feel like his ceiling is, even though I'm not a huge fan of comparison, is like Adam Thielen, like a very good route runner, a very good wide receiver. You know, he just makes plays. He's not overbearingly dominant. He performs better when he has a guy like Stephon Diggs or Justin Jefferson opposite him. Um, maybe like a Juju Smith-Schuster type of deal. We saw how dominant he was with a guy like Antonio Brown. Fell off a little bit when he was asked to be the number one. Then they got Deontay Johnson, Chase Claypool. He was starting to come back. Definitely seems like a solid role player. Low end, wide receiver one, wide receiver two probably suits him better. And I think it was a great draft pick for the Lions. And I am, again, even though I don't root for the Lions, I am glad to see him coming around.
And just to tack on this before we wrap up quotes of the week, it was an anonymous source. I have no idea where it came from, but I heard a quote that was, a Lions win is like the McRib. It happens once a year. So we got to enjoy it while we can. And with
Absolutely. And
that,
George, I
go
do
ahead.
want to actually give a call back to a quote from earlier in the week. Since
Okay.
we did have Gardner Minshew start. I'm glad that he was finally able to relieve himself because
Just the way you said that was
he was finally able to relieve himself because earlier we told you the quote that he hadn't taken a
number 2.
poop in number 2 in weeks because number 2 isn't an option for him. Well, he went to the number 1 and he is finally cleansed and ready to keep rolling. But there is no quarterback controversy. Nick Sirianni said if Jalen is healthy after the bye, he will start. So I guess Gardner will start eating a lot of cheese to bind himself back up. So because number 2 is not an option for him.
He can keep relieving himself over the bye week because he's number 1 until the Eagles say otherwise. But that's a great callback, something I didn't even think of. Good job, Cody. And yeah, then we can move into our main segment of the show, our Week 14 waiver wire. And because there's no real number 1 hit waiver wire this week, I just wanted to throw up a little segment here to check if they're available on your waiver wire. Because there's some guys that are not owned everywhere that I think are approaching status where they should be. So I'm going to have this posted on the couchgms.com on my article. So make sure you go check it out if you missed the names or want to hear them, actually read them out instead of me just reading them to you. But Chuba Hubbard's the first one. He was just on a bye, so he probably slipped through the cracks a little bit last week. But starting running back, Devante Freeman, he had another great week for the Ravens. He's someone who should be owned widely. Elijah Moore, we talked about him a little bit already, especially with Corey Davis out. Make sure you're grabbing Elijah Moore. Tyler, like I'm saying this one, and he's been right on my tail with talking about Pat Freiermuth. He's still less than 50% owned. Go grab Pat Freiermuth, especially if you're someone who is relying on Logan Thomas. There's your answer. Chase Edmonds, he's coming back from his injury. He had to get dropped a couple of places, so check out for Chase Edmonds. And another person returning from injury is Julio Jones for the Titans. He'd be wide receiver 1 until A.J. Brown comes back, so go grab Julio if he was dropped anywhere as well.
Yeah, and I just want to remind everyone, Julio Jones was opened his practice window to come off IR, and he could be the number 1 wide receiver through the fantasy playoffs, essentially, because remember that the IR rules say that you're out 3 games, not 3 weeks. So that's actually 4 weeks for A.J. Brown because the Titans did have a bye, so he should have 2 more weeks or 2 more games he would have to miss before he's eligible to return. So, we're already talking week 2 of the fantasy playoffs. That's if he returns on time. So I do like the Julio Jones if somebody would have dropped him, mostly in those leagues that don't have IR spots or just weird owners. I'm not weird owners. That's a little bit too harsh, but owners that play fantasy a little bit different than the rest of us. But some other names that we should be talking about waiver wires. George hit it on the head. There isn't this. We had Alexander Mattinson last week. Well, there's no Alexander Mattinson this week, and thankfully that's because there was no major injuries. So some guys that you might want to consider. I'll start off with the quarterback position. That's Taysom Hill. Now, his performance wasn't great against Dallas. They'll be like, he threw 4 interceptions. He did, but he still had over 20 fantasy points because he had over 100 yards rushing on the ground. And I'll say it every time we talk about quarterbacks, running quarterbacks are a cheat code in fantasy football. Literally 10 rushing yards is equivalent to 25 passing yards. So especially for running quarterbacks, he had the extended break playing on Thursday night. I know he's dealing with a little bit of finger, but he should be back ready to go. He was able to play through it. So Taysom Hill only owned in 5.2%. If you're missing a Jalen Hurts this week, if you are worried about Joe Burrow's pinky, you probably weren't relying on Daniel Jones, but he's probably going to miss another week again. So there's definitely some options out there. So I like Taysom Hill this week as a waiver wire addition.
Definitely. He was right on the fringe of going into my list, so I'm glad you mentioned him here, Cody. I'm going to flip us then to the running back position. I'm just going to talk about Titans running backs because you don't really know who is going to be the guy. It's going to be Deontay Foreman and Dontrell Hilliard. They're both around or a little below 20% owned in NFL.com leagues. I like Deontay Foreman better, mostly because he's the one who's been the pound the ground running back. He got more carries than Dontrell Hilliard in the last game. And the thing that worries me about Hilliard is he's taking a role as a passing back that's already been taken. So I think that even though Foreman may not be used as much in when they are healthier at running back, I think Foreman's going to be a guy who gets the most carries, gets the most opportunity. And both of them ran for 100 yards in their last game. I think he kind of slipped through the cracks because they had a bye last week. People were trying to find more fills, or they were trying to get an Alexander Madison last week. They could be solid fantasy running backs down the stretch because we know if Derrick Henry comes back this regular season, it's probably not going to be till earliest week 17, which would be your fantasy championship, probably week 18 or the actual NFL playoffs. So that backfield's still wide open through the fantasy season, most likely.
Yeah, you're definitely not relying on Derrick Henry. I'd be shocked if
No,
he's back before the playoffs. And I know there were some reports after his injury that he's might not even be done, or he's most likely done for the rest of the season. So, I mean, if they make it to the Super Bowl, there's always that type of chance. But we'll keep it with the running backs, talking about fantasy wise. And I know last week was a big week. We're talking about Chuba Hubbard with the CMC news. We just mentioned again on the check if available. But the one guy I think that is very interesting, and if none of these guys are, must starts, you're looking more for a depth option. I really like the addition of Amir Abdullah. I know Chuba Hubbard, he started out really well in relief for CMC the first injury. Then Royce Freeman got a little bit of injuries. Amir Abdullah started getting involved. He's a little bit of a pass catching option. And we just talked about it. They fired their OC. It could be a little bit, change of philosophy, how they want to play. The pass catching ability, Amir Abdullah that's what he excels at, can replace those roles. So I think Amir Abdullah is definitely a sneaky add this week. That could be a potential big name acquisition depending on how it plays out, because we haven't seen Chuba take over the lead role since CMC came back. They were just on bye last week, so there's still a lot to figure out how that team is going to go moving forward.
definitely. And I mean, I feel like at this point of the fantasy season, regardless of how you think Chuba Hubbard's going to be, if you're like somebody who is relying on the Panthers, like if you're relying on Chuba Hubbard, I like grabbing handcuffs this time of year. Like you can ask Cody in our league of record last year. I was a Dalvin Cook and Miles Sanders owner. I only owned 4 running backs on my fantasy roster when it came to the fantasy playoffs, and it was Cook and Sanders, and then Scott and Madison. I would just handcuff myself and said, "These are 2 backs who are going to be good if their starters out. I'm just going to run with it." So Amir Abdullah has been a fairly successful running back in the past. If they do decide to roll with him, or if Chuba Hubbard goes down, it's not bad to grab an Amir Abdullah. You could start him in that case. I like grabbing handcuffs as you're getting into the fantasy playoffs. Now we can go to a backfield, though, that is a lot less clear. And I'm going to talk about Seattle. I personally like Rashad Penny. And I know, Cody, I think you might come back and fight me on this one in a second. But Penny actually got almost as many touches as their new acquisition, Adrian Peterson. Peterson's the bigger name. Peterson scored the touchdown. But Rashad Penny was far more dependable in that game. He had so much more success running the ball in that game than Adrian Peterson did. Peterson barely averaged a yard per carry. So I think that the Seahawks are definitely going to try to use Peterson because they want to try to get him going. But Rashad Penny was somebody who wasn't in the mix for a while. He's back off his injury. He looks good. I think he's going to be at least 50-50 with Adrian Peterson if the Seahawks are doing anything smart about their backfield right now.
I'm not even going to disagree with you on what you just said, but I'm just going to give you the reason why I would still pick Adrian Peterson over Rashad Penny.
Okay.
It's not because I don't think Rashad Penny's the better back. I mean, he was a former first-round pick. Like, a lot of people criticize the Seahawks for making him a first-round pick, but he was a former first-round pick. You mentioned it. Peterson had a touchdown, but in half-point PPR, finished with 7.6 points. Penny
16 whole yards.
6.2. Now, granted, Peterson had a fumble. But I think the Seahawks, and this is just my beliefs, this is where I'm going with what my gut's telling me. When we talk about trusting your gut, when we talk about fantasy football, Peterson is going to be the goal line, red zone running back. Now, Penny could get them all the way down there, and I still think they'd pull him for Adrian Peterson. I think Adrian Peterson, he just got there on Monday. His playbook could have been limited. I know Penny is coming off an injury, but he's at least been in the system for the last 3 years. So I do think Adrian Peterson is the better option. I think he'll be more touchdown reliable, but he will also be very touchdown dependent. I think the days of him getting 100 yards rushing are over. Like, you're hoping for, 40 to 60 yards and a touchdown. You're hoping for a 10 to 12 points. A very low ceiling type of play. Whereas I think Penny, maybe he does break a big run, or he has multiple catches, or catches a touchdown or something like that. But I do think he could be limited to just yardage and not get the touchdown. So they're not great options at running back. But if you're struggling, like a lot of us are at running backs, we're losing running backs left and right. There's some running backs on bye this week that are going to be tough to navigate. I think if you have to, both of these guys are worth a shot.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't even know if I would say you probably could start an Adrian Peterson this week if you were desperate and hope for a touchdown. You could start a Rashad Penny hoping that he still is getting 50% of the carries there and breaks a long run or catches a couple of passes, but there are probably better options. I look at this as I'm trying to find a slightly longer term option. Like, I'm hoping Penny does edge out Adrian Peterson, or you're hoping Adrian Peterson does edge out Penny a little bit more, but this is why we said there's no real clear waiver wire additions in this group, just because a lot of it's speculative or trying to get ahead of the game, hoping you can get somebody who can help you in a pinch down the stretch in the playoffs, because no one is really blowing you away this week.
Yeah, I'll have to ask you I'll try to remember to ask you on the Thursday, or I guess we're recording Friday, so it'll be out Saturday for you guys. But like a guy like Jamal Williams at the Denver Broncos, or one of the Seahawks running backs. I just forgot what team they're playing. Dear Lord. Well, once I figure out what team they're playing, I will. Oh, the Texans. That's right. So it's like, if Swift's out, you'd think Jamal Williams would be a good play. He wasn't that great. He had his first fumble in his career. Congrats to being the all-time leader in most carries without a fumble. Jamal Williams, that streak came to an end. But he only had 8 points. And this week he goes up against Denver. And now you get one of these Seahawks running backs against the Houston Texans, which they have been bad on. So those are like the tough matchups, and could be, crucial in a game that could determine your fantasy playoffs. But I'll let you think about that, and I'll come back to that on our show later in the week. I'm going to move on and talk some wide receivers here. George still has one more running back to talk to you, but I'm tired of talking running backs. I'm ready to get to wide receivers, and that will be KJ Osborne. This is just merely because we talked about Adam Thielen is out for an injury. We saw Osborne catch a touchdown in the end zone. Um, I'm not saying he's going to have the same amount of production as Adam Thielen. I think that would be a little bit crazy, but this offense definitely does flow through two wide receiving options. So I think Osborne is definitely a guy worth adding. He could be a flyer, could definitely help you out down the playoff stretch as long as Adam Thielen is out. And I do think you also need to check on Tyler Conklin if you're playing tight end dartboards. I know this week isn't the best matchup, so you might not need a Tyler Conklin for the Thursday night game against the Steelers. But I'll keep an eye on him. But KJ Osborne is probably the wide receiver this week that makes the most sense and is probably the top waiver acquisition of the week.
No, I mean, you say that, and I actually agree. I love KJ Osborne especially without Adam Thielen for a few weeks, but I feel like I've kind of been doing some like scouting on some other experts out there, and he's somebody who slipped through the cracks. There's other wide receivers that experts like that they're not looking at KJ Osborne. So I like that addition. That's something that maybe even other owners in your league aren't thinking about, and he'll be able to get him as a 10th waiver or whatever it might be, but could be a great flex option through this bye week or even in the beginning of the fantasy playoffs until we see an Adam Thielen again, if we see an Adam Thielen again. So I like that. Cody did mention I have one other running back. I'm just going to kind of inch over him. It was Tevin Coleman, just basically a volume ad because the Jets are featuring Tevin Coleman at this point. There's not much Ty Johnson anymore. But Tevin Coleman is a poor man's Michael Carter. I feel like at the beginning of the season, if I said that, people would look at me sideways. But Michael Carter was already a borderline running back play. Tevin Coleman, even more so. If you're desperate for running back, you can know you're going to get volume out of him, but that's about it. Then I'll move on to the wide receiver position here with Cody. One of the guys who people seem to have a man crush on, and he does have some decent weeks, but he has all these injury problems, and it's Devante Parker. Parker did look decent coming off injured reserve this week, but you also have to remember, like, he might have been the wide receiver one coming into the start of the season. That's a role that Jalen Waddle has taken now. He's going to be the wide receiver too. You also have Mike Gesicki in there getting a lot of targets. He's a very talented wide receiver, but there's other mouths to feed in that offense now. He might be a good speculative ad. He's not my favorite.
Yeah, I think I like Devontae Parker a little bit more than you, which isn't surprising because you're definitely a lot higher on Jalen Waddle. Not saying he hasn't performed it. Jalen Waddle did leave a little banged up on Sunday, so that's definitely something we'll monitor throughout the rest of the week. But you mentioned it. There's a lot of mouths to feed. I mean, I think in that game alone, the touchdowns went to Mac Hollins and Isaiah Ford on Sunday. So
yep, they've spread the ball out.
There's just guys that eat away at opportunities. They're not a team that's putting up a ton of yards. But if Waddle would for some reason miss time this week, I don't expect him to, but if he would, I would. Devontae Parker is 100% a smash play at that point. But if Waddle's there, he's the number one wide receiver option. I completely agree. I'm going to steal. Nope, I'm not. I'm actually going to go back to running backs. I wasn't going to talk about this guy because we're recording this on Monday. Well, actually, the Monday night game has just kicked off as we're finishing up the show here. But so I put an asterisk next to us on the rundown of my list of guys, and that is Matt Breida. If he comes out and carries a load, I know the weather is not great for this Monday night game that you have already know the results of by the time you're listening to this. If he came out and played well, again, looked like the number one back, had decent amount of carries, I think you should add him. I know they have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers next week. It's not a great matchup. However, the Buccaneers have fallen down the rankings against the run, so they are allowing some of it. They are a high-powered team, but if we see Devin Singletary or if Zach Moss gets back in the action, well, then just ignore everything I've said for the last 2 minutes. But Matt Breida is a guy that you should be at least have in the back of your mind as a potential running back to add if he's slowly becoming the starter for Buffalo.
And Buffalo's still one of those teams that I have a hard time trusting running backs because they're all over the place. But Breida has been pretty good. We'll have to see how that Monday night went, and we can ignore Cody's message, like he said, if it looks like Matt Breida was not the starter this past Monday. I have one more wide receiver to add to the list. I think it's the last guy we have, and it's Russell Gage. So I feel like I've been so hot and cold on him, but he's now put together a couple of weeks where he's actually seen targets. I believe he saw 12 this past week, which is his career high, I want to say. I thought I saw. And I think that they're actually trying to get him involved in the game plan now. Like, the Falcons look like a better offense with Cordarrelle Patterson, and he's actually doing a good job of opening up the field for a Russell Gage, for a Kyle Pitts. So this is a situation where there could be three weapons, and it makes it that all three of them are fantasy relevant because it's making defenses look different ways. So Russell Gage has been a little better lately. He saw a lot of targets last week. I think he's worth a speculative add and could be a flex play if you're desperate for a wide receiver this week, or if you're going into the fantasy playoffs and you're banged up, maybe you had an Adam Thielen.
Definitely, George. I think we hit a ton of guys. If there's any guys out there that you're like, hey, I really like this guy. Well, you know what? I'm not going to tell you not to pick him up because we've talked about it. Go with your gut. If you really like a guy, if you think you have an upper edge, if you saw someone on Twitter that you trust was like, hey, this guy's getting a lot of work in practice, maybe it's not a guy we're talking about. Adam, there's not a clear number one for this weekend. If you have any questions about other guys that weren't mentioned, be sure to reach out. But the last thing we have to do here is preview the Thursday night matchup.
And Thursday Night Football this week is the Pittsburgh Steelers traveling to the Minnesota Vikings. Wow, two teams on totally different trajectories at this point. Steelers came up with a big win against the Ravens. Vikings lost to the Lions. And I think we already hit a lot on the Vikings, so let's try to get through them really quick. You still have Justin Jefferson there. The Thielen injury brings in KJ Osborne and Tyler Conklin, even though Conklin may not be as big of an add-on as a Thursday tight end. And then you have Alexander Mattison, obviously. I don't know. What do you think about a Kirk Cousins, or did that kind of wrap it up?
No, this game is played after 4 p.m. Eastern. I'm not playing Kirk Cousins.
Good.
I will say it's very interesting to me that the Vikings actually came into this game as the favorites.
Has that changed since Sunday?
Yeah, after Sunday, this game opened as Vikings as the favorites. I was a little confused by that, but hey, all I know is last week the Steelers, it was the first time that the Ravens were ever favored in Pittsburgh against Ben Roethlisberger, and they came out and won. So maybe Pittsburgh needs the odd makers to bet against them. Now we do have a little bit of some injury reports, but there's no surprises. There wasn't a full practice. It was more of just a walkthrough meeting, so their estimations. But yeah, Dalvin Cook, Adam Thielen, they're most likely not. I'd be shocked if any of them get back. I know they're holding out hope, but in all honesty, the 10 days rest will do wonders for them. So those guys are out. There's some guys in the secondary for Minnesota that could be injured. So we'll have to talk about the Steelers wide receivers. But I think you hit all the Vikings on the head. Alexander Mattison, you're going to play him. It's probably not going to be as good of a week as he just had against the Detroit Lions. But as long as he is the number one guy, he has shown consistently that he is a fantasy option. And honestly, this guy should have never hit the waivers all season long. He's just a guy that you hold before this because you know Dalvin Cook doesn't stay healthy all season long. In games that he has been the starter, he has scored 17 points or more in those 3 games. So that's pretty impressive there. But let's pivot to the Steelers. I know you and your girlfriend were watching this game pretty closely. Before we talk about the Steelers matchup, I do want to go back to the Sunday game. How did you like the go for 2 decision?
So I know, I also was listening to this game on CBS, and Tony Romo was the announcer. So you know how Tony has his little quirks and whatever. And he literally said, I just want the Ravens to go for 2, end this game right here, instead of taking it to overtime and getting all wishy-washy with it. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, the Ravens are going for 2. So Tony calls one again. But I think it was a good move when you look back in hindsight and listen to the Ravens went for it because they're so banged up in the secondary, and they just lost their top corner, Marlon Humphrey, in that game as well. The Steelers were starting to get momentum in that game. Their offense was starting to move, and the Ravens didn't think they could hold up on defense for another drive. So that's why they went for it, thinking that was their best chance to win. I don't hate it for that reason. If there was no reason like that, I think that would have been a dumb move, and you should have just taken it to overtime, knowing that you are traditionally a dominant defense. The game was pretty low scoring, and you have one of the best kickers in the league who not only wouldn't have missed that extra point, probably would have given you a good chance to get a long field goal in overtime.
Alrighty, I had to ask, but let's talk about those Pittsburgh Steelers that did get the victory. I know the big report out of the weekend was that, there was some whispers that this Ben Roethlisberger was saying this was his last year. Mike Tomlin kind of debunked that a little bit, but we'll know how much of that he was just protecting his players. We'll have to wait and see after the season. The big name to watch is, again, they didn't actually practice on Monday, so the injury reports are an estimation, but Chase Claypool would not have practiced with a toe injury. I don't know what it is with these toes. Can't seem to escape them. So Claypool is a big name to watch. Not saying that I think this week is the week against the Vikings secondary that you're willing to play, Chase Claypool. I think he could be a solid flex option for you because their secondary, I think they're 31st against the pass. The Vikings are, so definitely do like Chase Claypool if he can go. Ben Roethlisberger wouldn't have practiced either, but I don't think he's practiced any Wednesday, and the Monday before Thursday night game is equivalent to a Wednesday all season long, so keep it on there. But Deontay Johnson, he's a smash hit. We talked about Pat Freiermuth. Get the guy in your lineup, or at least on your team. Like the fact that we're now heading into week 14 and he's still under 50% owned is mind-boggling. And then obviously Najee Harris is like a must start.
So just because we're talking about Pat Freiermuth and he's a pretty widely available still, and we talked about Tyler Conklin, I know where I'm going with this. If you had the option of both on the waiver wire and wanted a tight end this week, would you go with one of these, and which one would you go with?
If it was between Conklin and Freiermuth, I would definitely go Freiermuth, not only for like season long, but this matchup alone, Freiermuth has a better matchup than Tyler Conklin.
Okay. So Conklin, maybe not a bad play if you're desperate, maybe somebody you should add to your roster, even if it's for next week. Freiermuth, please just add him. You probably can start him. I know there's plenty of leagues where I'm starting him unless I'm somebody who owns like a Kyle Pitts, or I started Dallas Goedert over him in a league this week and that worked out, but should be more than 45% owned. And I think you hit everything else on the head with the Steelers. Claypool's the only one that sketches me out a little bit because I'm worried of him having a toe injury on a short week, but the matchup is so good that if he is in, you have to play him because he only needs 2 catches to have a good week. That's just the kind of player Claypool is.
Absolutely, George. Well, I think that wraps up our Thursday night preview. Like you've mentioned, we will be back Saturday morning. We will be recording because Tyler will be able to be with us Friday night. So maybe it'll be even out late Friday night. That's all up on George. We'll see. I'll let George talk about what he is gesturing me through the internet via the video chat that we are on right now. But as always, thank you again for listening to another episode of the Couch GMs podcast. And obviously, Tyler is not here with us. He'll be back later this week, but he would like to tell you this podcast is more fun for us and more fun for you when you get involved.
Yes, and I was gesturing to Cody, making myself a little fake mustache because that's where you're going to be seeing Tyler in our late week episode on Saturday or Friday night. But yes, thank you guys for listening in again to the Couch GMs podcast. For Cody Roadcap, I'm George Kurth, and we'll see you all later in the week.